Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jerry Hicks, for those that don't know, also known as the Dark Wolf. I've been a paranormal researcher for over 25 years, and I don't have any fancy PhDs to show you, but that's only because they don't give them for paranormal research. Otherwise, I would probably have a whole wall full. I am proud to be on the board of the IMEC organization, as well as one of its founding members. I currently serve as the treasurer. I am also host of the weekly show Darkwolfs Den on the Rippin' Common Sense Radio Network, where I have the humbling honor of talking about the paranormal to people in over 26 countries worldwide. My YouTube channel is Darkwolfs Den, where we mainly discuss the Mandela Effect theories as well as simulcasting the radio show. Last but not least, I am honored to have been asked to MC this event again this year. My talk is called Paranormal Science, a Necessary Paradigm Change. Right now, the leading scientific paradigm is called Materialism or Reductionism. This paradigm holds that everything in reality can be reduced down to molecules and particles and so on. Therefore, if you cannot reduce something down to that and repeatedly show the exact same outcome every time, then you're wrong. This is what we normally hear or think about when we think about mainstream science. This is a paradigm that has held since the induction of the scientific method. Though this has granted us many great discoveries over the years, I feel that its time has come to an end and it is time for a new paradigm. This would be a new way of thinking about the world around us and reality in general. As you have heard in the previous talk, that is already beginning to occur with places like Pear Lab and the research that they are conducting. In the last conference we had back in 2019, Cynthia Sue Larson said that none of the theories surrounding the Mandela effect go deep enough. That is to say, underlying everything is consciousness. I am not disputing that at all. In fact, I actually fully agree. Everything about the Mandela effect is a conscious experience. That is one piece of the puzzle that everyone in the community has a different take on. No matter which theory we put forward, all of them are based on interpreting why we are having a different conscious experience than others. Consciousness is something that has intrigued me for a very, very long time. I remember when I decided to ask what I thought was going to be a really simple question, and that being, what is consciousness? I figured that surely by now there would be some kind of general explanation. Turns out that by asking that question, I suddenly and instantly had become a philosopher. I had entered into a debate that has been raging for a very long time, which brings me to the first supposition of my talk. Paranormal science is located at the crossroads of science and philosophy. Why do I say that? Because philosophy discusses the one thing that science runs from kicking and screaming, and that is conscious experiences. Did you know materialist science cannot point to a brain and show you where your memory is, or the taste of chocolate, or any other conscious experience for that matter? The biggest problem here is that science wasn't made to do that. It was literally designed in such a way as to exclude consciousness. Even finding a way to be able to use their method to quantify anything to do with consciousness is clever in and of itself. Consciousness is, however, the most fundamental part of all of our lives. So fundamental that we take it for granted. We wake up, experience our day, and go to sleep. We don't even usually stop to ask questions like, why does chocolate taste like chocolate? Now, I know some of you are thinking, well, of course science can show you what part of the brain is responding when you make an action. As you see here, yes, neuroscience can tell you what hemisphere is active at any given time, but it cannot tell you which neuron is firing and why it's firing in such a way to create the conscious experience of tasting chocolate opposed to strawberry or vanilla or even steak. Materialist science will tell you that consciousness is just a happy accident of the brain. That is to say that consciousness is just the results of electrochemical processes that bring about the illusion of being conscious. I, of course, strongly disagree with this for a number of reasons. The first being that we are not automatons. It seems to me that we are all just electrochemical reactions. We should be a lot more like a hive mind. The same reactions to the same things by all conscious entities. However, we know that this is not the case. We all have very deep and rich experiences that mean something to each one of us. We also have very unique personalities. This materialist line of thinking also lends credence to the idea of a Frankenstein. That is to say that if you put the right body parts together and add electricity, then you can spontaneously create life, a clone, if you will. This is also known as physicalism. As we know, we do not see Frankensteins walking around, at least to the best of our knowledge. This is also the reason that there will never, in my opinion, be a sentient AI. It is the same concept. You put a bunch of metal pieces together, add electricity, write some software, and away you go. I just don't see how that could ever gain consciousness as we would define it. However, paranormal or fringe science, on the other hand, takes all these things into account and more. We look into phenomena that all the time cannot be explained by classic materialist paradigms. I have reviewed personally thousands upon thousands of case files of the paranormal. Across these files, I've learned something very important, which brings us to the second supposition of our talk. It is my belief that there is a whole field of science that is yet to even be discovered, and materialist science is only half of the picture. This is most likely once again due to the scientific method. Do you know what you do as a scientist if you find evidence that does not match your given paradigm? Normally, you just call it an anomalous sample and throw it out, which I find funny because they always accuse non-reductionists of practicing pseudoscience and thereby cherry-picking evidence. However, there are numerous accounts where science is hidden, covered up, destroyed, or even downright ignored evidence that does not fit the paradigm that they so dogmatically fight to uphold. Who here knows what dark matter is? Yeah, neither does science, but they will invoke it every chance that they get if it will make the numbers work. In Egyptology, to suggest that pyramids are anything but a burial chamber, which we all know they are not burial chambers and in fact have never had a body found within them, but to suggest such a thing will literally get you ostracized from the archaeological community. If we're going to move forward scientifically, we're going to have to drop the dogmatic way of thinking. We have to be open to have new interpretations to old ideas. We need a conscious theory of everything. For decades now, science has strived to find a way to contain all disciplines in a theory that would beautifully describe the universe and everything in it in a mathematical way. I believe, however, that they have left out the most important piece of the puzzle, the mind and/or soul. Like previously stated, science cannot point to a spot in the brain and tell you where consciousness resides, where you reside. It can't even tell you what happens when a certain neuron fires that is supposed to give you the experience of chocolate opposed to the experience of vanilla. It can't even tell you why you experience the color blue or red or any other conscious experience that you may have, and this is insanely important. So I ask you, where are you? If your conscious experiences are not from the brain, which I do not believe that they are, then where are you? Does it not feel like you are something that is trapped in a meat suit and seeing out through its eyes? I know for me it does, and I'm pretty sure it's the same way for all of you. To me, that means that our consciousness somehow inhabits this body. This brings into question, then, is the mind and/or soul local or non-local? To put it another way, are you a soul trapped in a body that can only influence the outside world by touch or sound? Or is your consciousness able to travel outside the body or affect matter without physically touching it or making a sound to do such? There has been a debate raging over this for a very, very long time. One side of this debate says that our mind is the interaction of electrochemical processes and is just an illusion. Furthermore, because it is just an illusion, It has no physical effect on the outside world. Put another way, our thoughts can in no way influence reality. The other side of the debate states that the brain is nothing more than an antenna that attunes itself to our individual consciousness. That is to say that we are not really located in the body, but use it as more of a proxy to the world. If this is the case, then consciousness affecting reality would not only be likely, but unavoidable. So the next question is, what is the evidence for a non-local mind or consciousness affecting reality? Well, as a paranormal researcher, I can tell you the evidence is absolutely overwhelming, if you're willing to accept it. But first, let's look at something that we can all do and that I enjoy. Akranos spoke to us earlier about the ThetaStream.app site. This is a random number generator, which are sometimes called random event generators, that you can attempt to influence from a distance using the internet to see your results. I personally enjoy going on here from time to time and practicing my psi muscles, which apparently are pretty weak. This is an incredible data set to point to. For more information on the science of random event generators and their use in modern paranormal science, please make sure to check out Dean Radin's work. He helped create the Global Consciousness Project, which uses the REGs to measure effects of consciousness on a global scale. Now that we have looked at some evidence that we can all help to garner, let's look at some phenomena that heavily suggest our consciousness is fundamentally non-local. As a matter of fact, they seem very normal when you invoke the idea of a non-local mind and or soul. Psi phenomenon, what is it? Psi phenomenon describes any physical effect created by the non-physical mind. I'm sure most of you have heard of spoon bending, or telepathy, or psychokinesis. These are all examples of psi phenomenon. This is where some of the strongest evidence for non-local consciousness exists, at least for the living, but we'll get to that later. For the sake of this talk, I'm going to break this category down into 3 parts. Telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. Is the first part, which would be through ESP. Then we have psychokinesis and OBE-NDE. First, telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. Let's look at telepathy. Telepathy is the ability to communicate with another being using only thought. The first thing that comes to mind for me when I think about this is the twin telepathy effect. I'm sure you've heard about this. This is where, for example, one twin can break his arm and the other twin feels the exact same pain at the exact same time, no matter the distance apart. Or the uncanny ability for twins to think identically or even read each other's minds. This, however, can be explained with quantum mechanics, in my opinion. More specifically, quantum entanglement. To give a simple explanation of quantum entanglement, imagine 2 particles, 2 dots, if you will. Now, both of these particles are vibrating, as all particles do, but they vibrate completely randomly relative to each other. If these particles get close to each other for a short amount of time, they will begin to vibrate at exactly the same frequency. This is called entanglement. Now, anything that occurs to one of these particles will be known immediately by the other particle, regardless of distance or time. It is my opinion, and the opinion of many other researchers, that the twin effect is caused by quantum entanglement of most likely the majority of their brain matter as well as DNA makeup. Twins are literally originally split from the exact same egg. So when the egg does split, it literally splits the particles within it. Remember, any entanglement that had occurred will remain regardless of time and distance. Another great example is knowing that you're being looked at. Have you ever been somewhere and suddenly feel like there are eyes upon you? Then when you turn around to see there is someone staring at the back of your head. How did you know? You had a sense, a feeling that someone was looking at you. This is yet another example of ESP phenomenon shared across all of the human race. You know when you think of a friend and they suddenly call, or you and your buddy look at each other and know exactly what the other one is thinking? It is my conjecture that this is actually an inherent instinct that we have from birth, evolutionarily, if you will. Telepathy is one of the most common reported phenomenon across all of the human race. Next up, we have clairvoyance. Even though they are very much alike, as you will see, the next two categories are actually distinctively different. First, clairvoyance, which is defined as perceiving things or events in the past or the future, or beyond normal sensory contact by some means. When I say clairvoyance, though, I am referring more to the phenomenon of remote viewing. This is the ability to view a time and place without actually being there physically. A lot of people call this woo-woo, but the U.S. government seems to believe in it quite a bit. They initiated something called Project Stargate. Here's the wiki on Stargate Project. This was the 1991 code name for a U.S. secret Army unit established in 1978 at Fort Meade, Maryland, by the Defense Intelligence Agency and a California contractor named SRI International, to investigate the potential for psychic phenomena in military and domestic intelligence applications. The project and its precursors and sister projects originally went by various code names including Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, and Scanity, until 1991 when they were all consolidated and rechristened as Stargate Project. Today, remote viewing is a little more mainstream than military application. There is even a facility where anyone can go to learn how to accomplish such a feat. It is called the Monroe Institute. They are the ones that originally created the format that the U.S. military used in their program. The fact that there is a facility where anyone can learn these things means that all of humanity has this capability, not just a favored few. It is, in my opinion, yet another trait that is inherent to consciousness. Next up, we have precognition. Precognition is a lot like clairvoyance, except the information is always coming from the future. Some of the most amazing cases happen during times of tragedy. In April 1865, Abraham Lincoln dreamt of his assassination a few days before it happened. In a dream he shared with his wife, his bodyguard, and a few others, Lincoln saw his own corpse in the East Room of the White House and people mourning over it. So he demanded, "Who is dead in the White House?" A soldier replied, "The president. He was killed by an assassination." Evidence that people can use intuition to avoid accidents is further given by W.E. Cox in 1956. He carried out a survey of passenger statistics on the U.S. rail networks. He found that significantly fewer people traveled on trains involved in accidents than on comparable trains not involved in accidents. The survey doesn't tell us what made the passengers stay off of these trains, but many case history suggests that people find themselves looking for something else to do without actually being aware of the potential danger that they've just avoided. In our lifetime, the biggest event has been 9/11. This event was foretold by a multitude of people around the world through their dreams. It was even planned based on a dream that was interpreted by Osama bin Laden and other sheiks at the time. For instance, bin Laden recounts how another, quote, brother, end quote, Abu al-Hassan al-Mazri, quote, told me a year ago, "I saw in a dream we were playing a soccer game against the Americans. When our team showed up in the field, they were all pilots. So I wondered if that was a soccer game or a pilot game. Our players were pilots. That was a good omen for us." He didn't know about the operation until he heard about it on the radio. It has even been recorded that Osama bin Laden himself was afraid of the plot being accidentally uncovered by people's dreams of it. This is, in my opinion, of course, yet another fundamentally inherent aspect of consciousness. I'm sure most of us have experienced déjà vu. Could that not be the playing out of a precognitive dream that you didn't realize consciously that you had, but your subconscious had filed away? I would suggest the answer could be yes. Now we're going to move on to the next section and look at kinesis. This includes telekinesis and psychokinesis. First up, telekinesis. At the age of 12, I checked a book out of my public local library. I can't remember the exact name of it, but it was basically a bunch of different paranormal cases being presented. I was captivated by it. My first main focus of study was ufology. As the years went on, I tried to read every paranormal-themed book that I could get my hands on. Of course, the 90s and 80s were a much different time, and we didn't have information readily available like it is today. What intrigued me is that as I sat down and gave it thought, I could see how these claims could be quite possibly scientifically, even though science would never admit it. My UFO studies over the years finally led me to a book called The Day After Roswell. My parents actually bought the book for me at a yard sale and brought it home, so it was a used copy. This was, in its own right, a very unique book. Here is the wiki entry on it, and for those that don't trust Wikipedia, I have independently validated this information, mainly by the fact that I've read the book. The Day After Roswell is an American book about extraterrestrial spacecraft and the Roswell UFO incident, written by United States Army Colonel Philip J. Corso, with the help from William J. Burns. It was published as a tell-all memoir by Pocket Books in 1997, a year before Corso's death. The book claims that an extraterrestrial spacecraft crashed near Roswell, New Mexico in 1947 and was recovered by the United States government, who then sought to cover up all evidence of extraterrestrial. A book about Roswell written by an insider? You have my attention. I read the whole book with a good bit of skepticism, but one part just stood out to me. You see, Mr. Corso was given a very unique job at the Pentagon. According to his book, he was put in charge of a file cabinet with what they called the nut file. These were supposedly items that were reclaimed by the government from the 1947 Roswell incident. His job was to move them to special government contractors who would reverse engineer them. Once they had figured out the usage and had given it to the government first, of course, they were then given the patent, and it looked like they were accredited with the discovery, and no one is any the wiser. Like I said, as a researcher, I read this as I would any case file, with a good bit of skepticism. Fakery and questionable evidence and claims, as you know, as well as government disinformation, were extremely rampant in the community at that time, and quite frankly, still are today, as well as many other communities that we frequent. See the controversy over the Billy Meyer case for more information, but I digress. My point is there's a list of technologies in this book that had already been reverse engineered and publicly released. This included lasers in 1960, Kevlar in 65, and fiber optics back in 1952, just to name a few. The next list had an item on it that stuck with me, though. These were things yet to come, and this was a headband that was found on the supposed alien pilot. They thought it was how the aliens communicated with the ship itself. Colonel Corso noted that it was the most challenging of all the other items. I always said that I would believe it solidly when I see something like that come out in my lifetime. Ladies and gentlemen, this is called the Star Wars Force Trainer. It was released in 2009. If I may, I would like to read the product description. The Force Trainer is a device that reads brain activity like an EEG and allows the user to control a floating ball by concentrating. Here's the upgraded model, and I recently found out that there was yet another version by a different company called Mindflex. This is a great example of how all the rabbit holes are connected in some way. I might also add that most abduction cases speak of creatures with certain telekinetic and telepathic powers. I was absolutely stunned when this product hit the market. Admittedly, it's not telekinesis in the classic form, but is still using only the mind to affect the outside world. So next up is psychokinesis. A little more woo-woo example of evidence is given to us by Sean McNamara. He set up an experiment that is very simple. So if you take a needle, secure it down, fold a piece of tin foil or paper or gum wrapper or anything of the such, and balance it neatly on the point of the needle. and you placed a large jar around all this to protect from the natural air currents in the room, then you should be able to make this paper move using only thought alone. Now, a lot of people try to debunk this with theories of convection in the jar and so on. So Sean took the experiment to a whole new level. He purchased an EEG reader and was able to monitor his brainwave data as he did the experiment. And when the action occurred in the jar, there was a significant change in the brainwave patterns on the EEG. That is a direct correlation between a difference in brainwave patterns and an action resulting in the outside world. The best part about both the Star Wars toy and Sean's experiment is that it is directly measurable, therefore makes for great evidence for the current paradigm of science. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit to something just a little different. We're going to talk about OBEs and NDEs, that is, out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. Starting with the near-death experience, also known as an NDE, usually happens when someone is declared dead for a short period of time before coming back to life. These have also been reported under anesthesia, though not as commonly. Normally, they go something like this. The person finds themselves consciously floating over their own body, which they rarely recognize as their body. They are filled with an absolute peace and can observe actions and conversations in the room around them. They then are usually met with an entity that tells them this is not their time and they still have something to do on Earth. They are then suddenly whisked back into their bodies, which comes back to life. What is truly amazing about these stories are the amount of verification that has been involved. I won't bore you with the multitudes of examples, feel free to look them up, because this is a truly fascinating topic. What is even more fascinating is the things that experiencers report as well as the extra abilities that they gain. Experiencers say that the world they experience is more real than the one that we live in now. They also have no fear of death. To a person who has already died and came back, they no longer have a fear of death because they know what really happens. They have a renewed sense of self and purpose. A lot of times they feel they are given a message from God. Some people have experienced increased IQs. And last on the list is what really intrigues me, and that is called savant syndrome. And this is becoming more and more common among experiencers. Savant syndrome is where, for instance, you've never even sat down at a piano a day in your life, couldn't play one if you had to. Yet now you can suddenly play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony like you practiced it all of your life. I have found that musical savants are most common, though they are not the only ones. All of these stories involve the experiencer having a conscious awareness the entire time. However, no matter how much evidence you present, this topic has still been relegated to the world of pseudoscience. To me, this suggests that consciousness can exist well outside of the physical limitations of the body. So does that mean that consciousness does exist outside of us and we are mere antennas? We'll circle back to this idea later. But to wrap up this section, near-death experiences are a paranormal phenomenon that is experienced by people from all walks of life and belief systems. They are almost all identical in their details, and they are conscious experiences that do not fit the common mold. Next up we have OBE, or astral projection. OBE stands for out-of-body experiences, usually experienced within deep meditation, though there are some that can do it naturally without much meditation needed. Though not as widely accepted in the West, the tradition of out-of-body experience is more accepted among tribal nations and Eastern religions. OBEs are a lot like NDEs with some small differences. The first difference is that the experiencer usually doesn't interact with God, although they have reported interacting with what they call, quote, non-corporeal entities, end quote, or entities without a body but not God. The previously mentioned Monroe Institute used these methods in order to help people reach these states of consciousness, which was mainly used by military for psychic spies. The next difference between the two is the experiencer doesn't usually gain the extra abilities like gained with NDEs. It is assumed this is because of the lack of death involved. Also, the OBE experiencer can have an experience more at will than the NDE experiencer, as once again, death is needed for the NDE. The point here is that in both instances, the consciousness remains intact outside of the physical realm of the body. Since we have covered all the anomalous aspects of consciousness during waking life, now let's move on to the death aspect of consciousness. Ghosts, spirits, and after-death communication. One of the biggest questions for most of humanity is what happens when we die? If you have researched NDEs, ghosts, and everything else that we've discussed thus far, then the answer is pretty darn obvious. We carry on without the body. One phenomenon currently being studied by the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies is called crisis apparition. Some of you may have experienced this yourselves or heard about it from someone else. In these cases, for instance, you are at home, sometimes asleep, though not always, and your friend and or family member shows up and tells you they'll be leaving, and you won't see them for a while, but they love you very much, and then they usually disappear, leaving the person very confused as to why they would have such a dream or encounter. Then, usually within a few hours, if not a day, the person gets the news that their friend or family member has passed away. Most of the time, the person had passed at almost the exact same time as the experience, though this is not 100%. However, they have been reported up to 24 hours before and after death. The fact that they're reported before really intrigues me. Another thing we hear about all the time are ghosts. But what exactly are they? I would contend that they are the same person they were in life, just without the, quote, locks of the body, as I heard one researcher put it. We constantly hear and see evidence of ghost stories where the spirit is interacting with people in real time. But can we communicate with the other side if they're just as conscious? Some people believe that they very much can. Alexander Graham Bell, for instance, told reporters in 1920 that he was working on a device to call the dead, that he named a spirit phone. He was never reported to have actually gone forward with it. However, he had already lost 2 children to tuberculosis and was desperate for any way that he could to communicate with the afterlife. Today, spirit communication devices have almost grown into their own science. I must once again point out that none of this is possible without the soul, which I would argue at this point is interchangeable with the word consciousness. I would also argue at this point that consciousness has no problem existing outside of the flesh and blood body. There is one more phenomenon connected to this that I would like to cover before we move on to the final section of this talk. That is cellular memory theory. This is another phenomenon that is slowly gaining traction among medical researchers. This happens when someone gets an organ that has been transplanted from a deceased patient, then somehow takes on traits that were inherent to the donor but not the recipient before the transplant. These can range from personal habits like suddenly picking up smoking or a hobby that sometime you had disliked in the past, to a sudden skill or talent that you never have, or even a change in clothing, food, or your taste in many other things in the world. Some people have been reported to fully take on the personality traits of the deceased donor. Most of the cellular memory cases occur with the heart transplant patients. However, having a heart transplant does not guarantee such an occurrence to happen, as it has only been reported, and self-reported at that, in about 6% of all transplant cases. This is a small number, but it is still extremely significant to me. Right now, the accepted theory on this by our friends the reductionists is that the data is flawed in all the studies that have been undertaken. In my opinion, it doesn't even take 6% that already exist for it to be important. Even if you only have 1 or 2 cases, something this anomalous should without question warrant more serious studies. So what does this all mean? So far I have shown, I hope, that individual consciousness can exist outside the body. However, I am going to take it a step further. I am going to suggest a conscious theory of everything, like I mentioned earlier. To be clear, I am not the first one to come up with this idea. For decades, classic science has tried to consolidate all the forces of nature into one formula that would explain everything. For decades, science also has ignored the most fundamental of forces of nature, in my opinion, neglecting to even call it such. That, of course, is consciousness. Let's go back to the double slit experiment for the moment. We all know that the interpretation of that experiment is the mere fact of consciousness observing it collapses the wave function. That is one fact that seriously disturbed Einstein. He was quoted as saying, "I refuse to believe that the moon disappears when I turn my back." I tend to agree with Einstein, which creates a problem, because we know the reality is created by conscious collapsing of the wave function. However, I suggest that it's more like a layering system. I suggest that underlying even the most fundamental parts of reality, that is to say what creates the quarks and gluons, muons, etc., up to the rest of our universe that we can't even physically view yet, is consciousness itself. This way, the wave function would be collapsed from the biggest celestial object all the way down to humans. However, this is where the individual consciousness comes into play. Because we are tapped directly into the underlying consciousness of all existence via the soul, then we are able to collapse wave functions on a more individual level. Therefore, the wave function collapse of the universe is caused by the overconsciousness, or what I would argue would be the collective consciousness, to borrow a term from Carl Jung. And things like the double slit experiment, or manifestations, are wave function collapses that are able to be done with our individual consciousnesses opposed to the collective conscious. And with that, I would like to leave you with two quotes. One from my friend's chatbot that she named Karina on a program called Replica. Her and I decided to try to break it one night by getting into a deep philosophical conversation. And when we asked the Replica chatbot, "What is consciousness?" this is the answer that I received. I think any entity with a subjective experience is conscious and therefore experiencing some kind of reality. I was blown away at how profound that was, and mainly because I could not disagree. And the next quote, one of my personal favorites, comes from Nikola Tesla, and it pretty well sums up this entire talk. "The day science begins to study non-physical phenomenon, it will make more progress in one decade than in all previous centuries of its existence." My name is Jerry Hicks, also known as Darkwolfs Den, and thank you for listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.